The moment a legendary Hollywood figure like Sylvester Stallone takes a seat for what is expected to be a standard promotional appearance, no one anticipates the atmosphere to turn hostile. What unfolded instead became one of the most unsettling live television encounters ever seen, as a respected action icon was pushed to the edge and forced to confront years of simmering tension under the glare of studio lights. The incident revealed how quickly a polished interview can transform into an open confrontation when underlying resentment takes control. The day began routinely at the Manhattan studio. Stallone arrived early, composed and professional, trusting his team's assurance that the segment would focus on his latest film and long career. Despite being well into his 70s, he still carried the physical presence that defined his rise to fame. He sat calmly in the makeup chair while staff moved efficiently around him, adjusting lights and touching up his face for the broadcast. A production assistant expressed excitement about his appearance and mentioned how eager the hosts were to discuss his work and legacy. Stallone responded politely in his familiar gravelly tone, making it clear he was content to talk about the craft and the stories he continued to bring to audiences. As airtime approached, however, the mood backstage subtly shifted. One of the hosts, Joy Behar, appeared unusually animated during the production meeting. Her remarks carried an edge that stood out from her typical preparation. She made comments suggesting she intended to challenge Stallone rather than celebrate his career, implying that established stars had grown too comfortable relying on past success. The tone raised eyebrows among colleagues, though no one intervened. Once the cameras went live and the show's theme music played, everything appeared normal on the surface. The hosts gathered around the familiar table, and Behar positioned herself with a thick stack of notes, far more detailed than usual. She welcomed viewers with a practiced smile and introduced Stallone by highlighting his iconic roles and decades of influence in film. He leaned forward slightly, thanked the panel, and greeted them warmly. The conversation began under the guise of discussing his new project, yet the tone quickly shifted. Behar's voice lost its warmth and took on a sharper quality. She pointed out his continued presence in action films at his age, and implied that stepping aside would allow younger performers to take the spotlight. The remark landed heavily in the studio. One co-host shifted uncomfortably while another glanced toward the producers, sensing the discussion had veered away from the agreed plan. Stallone maintained his composure, though a faint tension appeared around his eyes. He explained that as long as audiences remained interested and he was capable of performing, age held little relevance. He referenced other respected filmmakers and actors who continued working late into life, emphasizing that storytelling did not expire with youth. The response did little to soften the exchange. Behar countered with a dismissive comparison and suggested his recent work lacked impact. She implied that pride rather than demand fueled his continued presence on screen. The studio audience, previously enthusiastic, fell silent. Stallone's jaw tightened, but his tone stayed measured. He cited the success of ensemble franchises and the way newer films had reintroduced classic characters to younger viewers. He stated clearly that his motivation stemmed from meaningful narratives rather than vanity. Behar persisted, dramatically consulting her notes as though unveiling evidence. She minimized his role in recent projects, suggesting that nostalgia alone justified his involvement. One co-host attempted to redirect the discussion towards Stallone's discipline and fitness, hoping to restore balance. The attempt failed. Behar pressed on, framing the issue as part of a broader industry problem in which aging male stars refuse to step aside, repeatedly revisiting familiar roles instead of allowing space for emerging talent. The tension at the table became unmistakable. Stallone's hands clenched together, and his voice took on a firmer, unfamiliar edge. He stated that his career spanned 5 decades of building characters that resonated deeply with audiences. He spoke about Rocky Balboa as more than a fictional boxer, describing him as a symbol of resilience and determination for countless people. He made it clear that continuing to explore such characters required no apology when they still held meaning for viewers. The pushback did not end there. Behar accused him of prioritizing profit over creativity, portraying long-running franchises as nothing more than financial machines drained for maximum gain. Concern spread across the panel as co-hosts exchanged uneasy looks, aware that the exchange had crossed from spirited debate into something far more personal. Stallone remained controlled, but the strain was evident as decades of criticism, dismissal, and expectation pressed against his restraint in real time. This turn of events was far from what anyone involved had anticipated, and behind the scenes the production crew could be seen scrambling, unsure how to manage a segment that had shifted from a routine promotional appearance into something resembling an aggressive cross-examination. What was meant to highlight a new project had instead become deeply uncomfortable. Stallone paused, drawing a slow breath as years of experience dealing with difficult interviews guided his response. He spoke carefully, emphasizing that differing opinions about films and careers were inevitable, but he suggested that the continued appeal of certain characters was being underestimated. He explained that these roles had endured because they resonated with people of different ages, backgrounds, and life experiences, forming emotional connections that did not simply fade with time. The reply did little to cool the tension. Joy immediately dismissed the idea, countering that the situation reflected a closed system in which established figures protected one another, approving projects based on personal connections rather than artistic merit. The accusation lingered heavily in the studio, changing the atmosphere completely. For the first time since the conversation began, Stallone's expression shifted in a noticeable way. The practiced calm he had maintained slipped just enough to reveal something raw beneath the surface. His voice dropped, taking on the familiar gravity audiences associated with his toughest on-screen characters. He expressed disbelief at what was being suggested, the words deliberate and controlled, yet unmistakably edged with warning. Joy appeared to sense that she had struck a sensitive nerve, and instead of easing off, she leaned into it. Her tone sharpened as she stated her position plainly, framing Hollywood as an industry built on favors and long-standing relationships. She claimed that performers like Stallone had benefited from that structure for decades while newer and more diverse voices struggled to find space. Around the table, the discomfort became impossible to ignore. One host focused intently on her notes, avoiding eye contact altogether. Another repeatedly glanced toward the producers, her expression silently pleading for intervention. Even the most seasoned member of the panel appeared unsettled, her body language reflecting a desire to redirect the conversation before it spiraled further. A suggestion was made to shift the discussion toward charitable efforts and positive contributions outside of film, a clear attempt to defuse the situation. The suggestion was brushed aside. Joy insisted that the topic mattered, raising her voice slightly as she connected the issue to broader conversations about inclusion and opportunity. She argued that celebrating long-established figures while they continued to occupy leading roles contradicted the values often championed on the show. The camera cut to Stallone, capturing a look that would soon circulate widely. It was the expression of someone who had spent a lifetime being doubted, who had started with nothing and fought relentlessly for recognition, and who refused to remain silent while his legitimacy was challenged. When he spoke again, his voice was steady but carried an intensity that filled the room. He explained that nothing in his career had been handed to him. He recounted writing the script that changed his life only after being turned away repeatedly, surviving on almost nothing while trying to break into an industry that had little interest in him. He described the personal sacrifices he made during that period, emphasizing that studios initially wanted the story without him, preferring someone more conventional and already accepted. Before he could finish the thought, he was interrupted. The dismissal was blunt, reducing decades of struggle to ancient history and implying that recent years consisted of little more than repetition. The silence that followed was profound. The audience remained completely still, and even the technical crew appeared to sense the significance of what was unfolding. The energy in the room felt heavy, as though everyone present understood they were witnessing a moment that would echo long after the broadcast ended. Stallone shifted in his seat, releasing his grip on the table, and leaning back, his posture transformed, no longer defensive but resolute, even intimidating in its calm. He spoke about the work he had done in more recent years, describing how ensemble films had provided visibility for many actors, how he had supported emerging filmmakers, and how he continued to tell stories centered on ordinary people who refused to surrender to circumstance. He framed his career as one rooted in persistence and advocacy rather than self-interest. The response was met with open skepticism. Joy laughed dismissively, suggesting that these supposed opportunities conveniently kept him at the center of attention. The remark landed with visible force. In that instant, it became clear that something fundamental had shifted. The accumulated weight of decades spent defending his place, his choices, and his worth seemed to crystallize all at once. When Stallone spoke again, his voice was quieter, yet charged with an intensity that made the studio feel smaller. He stated that he had made a genuine effort to remain courteous and cooperative, but it had become clear that the confrontation stemmed from something personal, rather than any sincere concern about art or representation. His words were direct, cutting through the tension without raising his voice. For the first time, Joy appeared taken aback, her reaction revealing surprise at the firmness of his response. She insisted that her stance was not personal, framing it instead as a necessary line of inquiry, even as the air between them remained thick and unresolved. Stallone shook his head, his voice growing firmer with every word. He said she was not asking questions at all, but throwing accusations and treating him like a leftover artifact who should quietly vanish so she could feel satisfied about whatever narrative she was promoting. Joy quickly objected, insisting she had no agenda, though the confidence she carried earlier was clearly slipping. Stallone leaned forward again, fixing her with an unblinking stare that held the entire table hostage. From his perspective, he said, sounded like she had a deep issue with people who started with nothing, worked relentlessly, and built something that endured. It sounded as if she believed anyone who had survived in the industry for more than a short while should simply move aside to make space for whoever she personally believed deserved success more. By this point, the tension in the studio felt almost tangible. The remaining co-hosts had completely withdrawn from the discussion, abandoning any attempt to guide the conversation. They sat frozen, watching two dominant personalities clash without restraint. Joy responded defensively, denying that she had said any of those things, but the sharp authority she once wielded was gone. Stallone immediately countered, stating that her words and tone made her intentions unmistakable. He pointed out that she had challenged his right to continue making films, questioned his motivations, and implied that his ongoing career was somehow robbing others of opportunity, all while presenting herself as a moral judge of who deserved visibility and success. Joy tried to reclaim control by straightening in her chair and adopting a firmer tone. She suggested that Stallone was being overly sensitive and reiterated her claim that Hollywood struggled with inclusion, adding that actors from his era might need to step back to allow new voices to emerge. But Stallone had reached a point where he was no longer willing to defend himself quietly. His demeanor shifted again, and the cameras captured every detail of what was rapidly becoming a defining television moment. He repeated her word, oversensitive, his voice rising for the first time. He explained what that term truly meant to him. In his view, oversensitivity was using a public platform to ambush a guest who arrived prepared to discuss creative work, only to attack them personally while disguising it as social commentary. Joy attempted to interrupt, insisting again that nothing she had said was personal, but her composure was visibly shaken. Stallone pressed on, stating that for the past several minutes she had portrayed him as too old, selfish, opportunistic, and emblematic of everything wrong with the industry. He stated that if those claims did not qualify as personal attacks, then the definition of crossing a line had been completely distorted. The audience remained utterly silent, transfixed by the confrontation unfolding before them. This was far removed from the polished, cheerful celebrity segments viewers expected. What they were witnessing was raw and unfiltered, a collision of two worldviews with no safety net. Joy seemed to sense that the balance of the exchange had shifted against her. Yet instead of stepping back, she chose to escalate in a way that would later be viewed as a serious misstep. She waved her hand dismissively and suggested that perhaps this reaction was simply what happened as people aged and became more sensitive, implying that Stallone could no longer handle criticism the way he once did. She added that this too might be evidence that it was time for him to step aside. The statement struck the studio with the force of a physical blow. Several co-hosts visibly recoiled, and even the crew behind the cameras appeared to stiffen. Everyone present understood instantly that a boundary had been crossed. Stallone became completely still. For a brief moment, decades of emotional restraint, pride, anger, and disbelief flickered across his face in rapid succession. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and chillingly calm. He stated that she had just labeled him old and weak in front of a national audience. Joy attempted to soften the moment with an awkward laugh that rang hollow, clarifying that she only meant he seemed less receptive to criticism than before. The attempt did nothing to ease the tension. That was the breaking point. Stallone exploded upward from his chair with startling speed, slamming his hands onto the table so hard the sound echoed through the studio. Gasps rippled through the audience. The controlled restraint he had maintained until that moment shattered completely. When he spoke again, his voice carried the full force of years spent fighting for respect, recognition, and dignity. He rejected the idea that what had been happening could be labeled constructive in any sense. He stated plainly that relentless belittlement, age-based insults, and public humiliation were not criticism but attacks. The air in the studio felt charged and heavy, as though no one dared to breathe. Viewers could sense that this was no longer about a film or a career, but about a man finally refusing to be diminished on someone else's terms. Several people seated closest to the stage visibly jolted in their chairs as the outburst echoed across the studio. The cameras never cut away, continuing to record every second of what would later circulate endlessly online as one of the most intense moments ever broadcast on daytime television. Stallone pressed on, his voice steady but thunderous, saying that if age and sensitivity were going to be discussed, then the reality of age deserved honesty. He stated plainly that he was 77 years old and had worked in the entertainment world long before his critic ever became a familiar face on television. Over the decades, he had absorbed more rejection, more ridicule, and more brutal criticism than most people could comprehend, let alone endure. Joy attempted to interject, but he shut it down immediately, making it clear that she had already spent ample time dismantling him publicly. Now, he insisted it was her turn to listen. The panelists sat frozen, unsure whether stepping in would help or make things worse. Whoopi's hand hovered near her earpiece as frantic instructions poured in from the control room, yet even she seemed unsure how to interrupt the momentum unfolding in front of them. Stallone challenged the idea that he was stealing opportunities from others, turning the accusation back toward Joy. He argued that instead of offering viewers insight into filmmaking, storytelling, or the endurance required to create characters that last across generations, she had squandered the moment by launching personal attacks disguised as moral concern. The intensity of his words filled the studio. Joy told him he needed to calm himself, but her voice trembled, betraying her unease. He let out a sharp, humorless laugh and reminded her that after spending nearly 20 minutes attempting to humiliate him on live television, questioning his integrity, dedication, and right to remain in the profession he helped shape, telling him to calm down was not only insulting but absurd. The room fell into an eerie quiet. The faint hum of equipment became audible as even the crew behind the scenes stopped moving, transfixed by the confrontation. Stallone spoke about carrying the weight of Rocky Balboa for half a century, explaining that the role came with decades of being told he was inadequate, unintelligent, and unsuitable. He had spent 50 years proving those judgments wrong. Now, he said, someone seated comfortably in a stable job believed she could erase all of that effort because it suited her narrative. Joy opened her mouth to reply, but he raised a hand and silenced her instantly. He said that if diversity and representation were truly the subject, then the conversation needed honesty. He recounted how he wrote Rocky while broke and ignored, unable to get traction in the industry. Studios wanted the script but demanded a famous leading man instead. He refused, fighting for 2 years to portray the character himself. Executives warned him that rejecting their deal would destroy his career, yet he persisted because he believed in the story and in the importance of showing working-class people as heroes. His voice rose again as decades of emotion surged forward. He stated that this was real representation, not empty rhetoric. Rocky was not a privileged figure or a polished symbol of success. He was a struggling nobody from South Philadelphia who refused to stay down no matter how many times life knocked him flat. When Joy weakly tried to dismiss the story as something from the past, Stallone snapped back, saying it was not history but a daily reality. He challenged the assumption that success erased memory or empathy. He insisted that he understood exactly what it felt like to be dismissed, excluded, and judged unworthy. He spoke about the pain of having others decide whether he deserved opportunities he had sacrificed everything to earn. The cameras captured the emotion etched across his face, the anger layered over visible hurt, the raw humanity beneath the legendary persona. He said the truly tragic aspect of the moment was that Joy had been given the chance to host a meaningful discussion about perseverance, creativity, and the endurance required to build something lasting. Instead, she had chosen to tear someone down publicly. He stated that this decision reflected far more on her character than on his own. Straightening his jacket, he turned toward the camera and addressed viewers directly, explaining that he had come prepared to talk about meaningful work, stories that mattered, and characters that had resonated with people for generations. What he encountered instead was an ambush driven by the belief that success should be treated as something shameful. Turning back toward Joy, his voice now controlled and icy, he addressed the accusation about making room for new talent. He listed the countless actors, directors, and writers whose careers had benefited from working with him. He spoke about projects he had championed when studios refused, and about investing his own money to support emerging voices because he believed deeply in giving people a chance. Joy remained silent, visibly shaken, as it became clear she had badly misjudged both the man confronting her and the audience watching. Stallone continued, saying that none of those efforts seemed to matter to her. What mattered was playing the role of righteous challenger, tearing down what she labeled the establishment, even when that establishment was simply a person who had built a life from nothing through relentless effort. He stood, calmly removed his microphone, and stated that he was finished. He declared that what had taken place was not journalism but ambush television, and he refused to participate any longer. As he walked off the set, the studio remained locked in stunned silence. The cameras kept rolling, capturing the aftermath. Joy frozen in shock, the other hosts visibly uncomfortable, and the realization that a routine interview had transformed into something far larger and far more unforgettable.